Okay, so I'm actually going to do my acknowledgments right now, and this is a project that's in collaboration with Doran Mason, especially from NOAA, and then a lot of the data you'll see is from EPA. And I did actually wanted to specifically say thank you to the federal agencies, especially because I really appreciate your work. The project really appreciates your work. The people who work under this project really appreciate your work. And I think their work is really important. And I really do want you to continue to do that work. I think you guys do good work out there. So I felt like I had to at least mention that specifically about the federal agencies that are contributing to this. In addition to that, we're also working with Zach here, who's from Wisconsin DNR. In any case, this project is focused on trying to answer some questions, the sort of the perennial question about how much fish is in the Great Lakes in part, but it is a broader context. How much stuff is being produced out in the Great Lakes in a modeling framework that gets us to the answer. And one of the simplest sort of way to think about that is that giant phytoplankton obviously produce slightly smaller zooplankton, which produce even smaller fish, and then one large salmon head occasionally out in the lakes. But in general, in a simplified way, this is what we're thinking about it, from phytoplankton up to fish. So when you look at Great Lake food webs, there's a lot of different ways in which we can think about modeling these in an environment. A lot of times we think about them in this format, which is extremely fish heavy, and I have no problem with that. I like fish a lot, and especially like the sea lampers up here at the top. I'm glad they got a shout out in this particular diagram. But in any case, they're extremely fish heavy, which is fine in one context because humans are really concerned with how many fish are out there, because in a lot of ways we interact with the fish very strongly, especially from the manager level. But there's a lot of other stuff that's down here. We understand that a lot of that stuff's really important. It often gets called either prey fish, or it becomes food-based, or we refer to it as the nutrient base that's available to these communities. And these all are related to one another, right? So phytoplankton out in the environment is converted to fish biomass in some way, and it must inherently be related. You can't produce fish out of nothing. There must be fish produced out of that phytoplankton that's out in the lake. So there is some relationship out there. What we would really like to do is have a very simple way of understanding that. There's lots of approaches to this though, right? So if we think about this, well, let's do a full model then. We'll model every organism out there in the environment. We'll think about this from the context of every species gets a little model, every species gets a bunch of little parameters. All the parameters do their little thing in the model and they produce some sort of output. And that may be fine, but we do have some problems with that, of course. There's a lot of parameters to measure in that environment. And there's the fact of the matter is that the world is constantly changing. And that is so very obvious now, especially in the Great Lakes, regardless of where you go. And there's lots of reasons for that. Not just things when we think about climate change, but things like nutrient reductions, changes in the landscape. All that kind of stuff feeds into what's out in the lake itself. So when you build up these really complex models, and this is an EcoPath EcoSim model, and there's again, nothing wrong with these models. These tend to be complex. This is a simplified version of a complex model, right? Not every species gets a bubble. In fact, a lot of species get dumped into the same bubble, and again, it tends to favor that top-heavy approach. Here's all of the phytoplankton species, they get one bubble. And then at the top, obviously, dolphins, which are common in the Great Lakes, get their own bubble up there. So, to be fair, so it's not a model from the Great Lakes, but the resulting sort of framework that you would see in a model from EcoPath EcoSim would be similar in a Great Lakes environment. You also have, often you have something like a fudge factor for detritus down at the bottom, and you parameterize all these relationships, which again are fine, but then you have to rely on relatively good parameters if you want the model to produce relatively good results, right? Junk in, junk out, presumably good stuff in, good stuff out. Those models are complex and take a lot of time, so the framework that we're operating under is a little bit simpler, and we're using this thing called side spectrum analysis. What we actually is going to assume are a couple of very, very simple things. Big things are going to eat small things, and that biomass in big things is related proportionally to thin things in small things, because that's where they came from. Okay, so actually for our modeling environment, the only information we need is an organism's individual weight and its abundance or density in the environment in that case. So relatively simple values out here. This model is not concerned with species. It does not care in general about species. It probably doesn't care too much about groups of organisms, although I'll show you that there is data that you can potentially extract from this model if you know more information about the groups. And it produces a very simple linear line, which you can fit with a linear model. You probably fit it with something like maximum likelihood, but it produces a relatively simple metric to understand. And when you look at this is an example of an ecosystem fit with a size spectrum model. It's a log-log axis, and that's what you're going to see on all the other stuff. So there's a log axis of abundance, a log axis of body mass, and what you can see is the little tiny stuff up here, which is phytoplankton and bacteria. It's really abundant, right? So it's high on this abundance axis. But the mass per individual is low, obviously low. So these are low individuals. Down here with our whales, there aren't very many whales out there, but there is a linear relationship from that phytoplankton down to that whale to some degree. Okay. And then down here, this paper was discussing something about how do you fit detritivores in that food web, and I don't have an answer for you yet, and we haven't really done that yet, but that is the kind of stuff that we also think about in the framework of these models. This is an example of one fit to Lake Superior. You can see that that nice linear line appears. There's some relationship here between algae, zooplankton, large zooplankton, which is a lot of things like limnocaunus and mysids, and then prey fish. And they actually estimated how much predatory fish would be in that environment. So there is some predictive power available in this model if it fits, and assuming that you trust the other values. So what are we actually using? So we're using a lot of EPA data for Glencoe, and we're a lot of that long-term monitoring that goes on in the lakes in the spring and the summer is available to us. So that's what we're using. We have right now phytoplankton, zooplankton from a lot of different sizes. So we have small zooplankton, that is zooplankton under 20 microns. We've got medium-sized zooplankton, that is stuff that's caught in 163 micron mesh. And then we've got large zooplankton, which is the mysid net. So this is the 500 micron up net where we catch the large organisms. We're going to try to include some benthic data soon, and then we're also considering including prey fish material from places like USGS as well. So just to give you an example of where this sort of sampling comes from, I haven't done this, I just sit behind a computer, so you can talk to Jim Watkins, who's gone out on this much more frequently if you're really interested in the details on this. But in general, the sampling is done every year. It's done throughout the lakes, and it's done in the spring and the summer. And you can see that the coverage is pretty good in the pelagic environment. The goal of the sample sites is that they be relatively similar to one another. So these sites are similar, and they are abundant in each lake. I do want to point out, since we have the map up right now, Erie, which is our perennial problem child in a lot of different ways when we think about modeling, is really broken into 3 different basins right here. I'm going to treat it like that in the stuff I'm going to show you. I'm also going to show it to you last. Not that I hate Lake Erie, but I do hate Lake Erie. No, I'm just kidding. Lake Erie is really interesting, but it also is a really complex lake relative to some of these other lakes where everything is well mixed and it's broken away from the shoreline. You're not worrying about any sort of interaction with the bottom in a different way than you would in Lake Erie. So I'm just going to jump right into it. So what I've done here is I have log of abundance. I'm not even going to show you that that's what this axis is called, and I have log of biomass on the other side. The first thing that you can see here is I did not produce a linear relationship, okay? And you can trust that I am not just making stuff up, but it's for Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Ontario. But there are these things that are called domes, and that's related to some functional group within these environments. And then there is a linear fit to part of that, those domes. So you can see there's actually probably a couple domes in there. There's probably a linear fit like that. So if we fit a linear relationship, because this is what really gives us some information about what's going on in these environments, then we get a slope. And the slope is really important for us because it gives us some information about how much big stuff is out there. I'll show you that in just a second. -1 is the assumed normal location for these slopes based on some theory that's done around this. And you can see that Superior falls right on that. Michigan falls lower than that. Huron falls even lower than that. And Ontario probably falls again around that -1. So why would you care about this? Well, the negative values are really important because if you have a more negative slope, you're actually moving away from large organisms and towards smaller organisms. So as you move into more and more negative slopes, you expect to see smaller and smaller organisms out there, right? So presumably at some extreme negative slope, you would have no predatory fish out there. I'm not saying that Huron doesn't have predatory fish. I'm not going to make that claim, but you're expecting to find fewer numbers of large organisms. We're going to deal, so in a very simple takeaway message, it's kind of stupid, right? So more negative, less big stuff, more positive, more big stuff. -1 is our standard. We need to evaluate that intercept broadly across more time. So I just showed you 2 years. And we need to worry about the intercept, which I'm actually going to call height, but that has to do with something called autocorrelation, which is dealt with down there. I do want to talk about Lake Erie, but I probably don't really have time to do that, but I do like Han Solo, so he can appear here. And then there's some information from Lake Erie here in different basins, and you can see that there's probably some more interesting stuff to draw out of this, but I don't really have time to do that in the context of the talk at the moment. We really do want to include more years, so this is only 2 years right now. We want to include more materials from the lakes, and we want to be able to make predictive power. So that's where this project is going, and that's where we are at this moment in time, as I literally just made those graphs yesterday. So we are moving this project along from just a bunch of data points. And with that, I will take any questions, and I thanks for your time.